This is our third session on urban policy analysis. We're starting actually, could you please just slide down the shade, yes, that's it. To move yeah, to pull down the sun. Yeah, that's good, yeah. Okay. Very good. Thank you very much. I guess so too, yes, please. The background for the market and economic analyses is really twofold, and we'll explore relations among them in these different readings. And they are Adam Smith, the father of the neoclassical analysis and the approach, which is well known at the University of Chicago Department of Economics, Milton Friedman, etc., and made this visibly important internationally today. The second is Karl Marx, with the father of Marxism. And they both, we want to introduce where and how they can be together in different writers' analyses. And I will put the two out there and keep this here for the next session in a minute or two, but I'll just leave this here, and you can twist your head if you want to see some of what is there. That links really with Saskia Sassen, which I'll talk about in a second. But if we go forward and backward, I'll mention cities specifically, and both our key readings focus on this in the sense of Paul Peterson and then Saskia Sassen, and then ways of joining these two with Glaser and Clark. So historically, in terms of the timing of this, I'll mention first Peterson's, but then go backwards. So Paul Peterson and I had two books we each had a book in draft form. And we taught a seminar with small number of students right here, as we had one chapter from one book and then one chapter from the other book through the quarter. And it was a very lively discussion because we had very big disagreements every session. And what he'd been working on a transformation that had been going on within the general political science discipline. He was trained as a political scientist. He did a couple of books on education in the city of Chicago, really public schools. That was his focus, on the politics of schools, which is very hot right now with the entire school board is resigning in the city of Chicago this week, in part because the mayor who was elected was previously a social political organizer for the union of the school teachers. So he then was successfully elected, and now as mayor, this is his big budget, a major budgetary commitment to increase a lot the budget for schools and school teachers. And so this has been if this is to be very expensive, should this be paid for through increasing taxes? Which some would say, if you want to spend more, you should raise the taxes in some models of government finance. The alternative is to borrow money and to pay it back perhaps in the future, but not to raise taxes today. So this is part of the battle And so this led to the school board arguing and resigning because of disagreements between the superintendent and the mayor. Okay, so that's the background of how this is, in a sense, that is. Let me add one more person who I've collaborated with very actively, is William Grimshaw. Bill Grimshaw was the campaign manager of Harold Washington. Before that, he was a professor at IIT, trained as a political scientist. He'd also worked in state government, but they'd also, Paul Peterson and Grimshaw, both did books on the teachers and the politics of teachers in education. Why? Because these are political scientists. They're not trained as educators or in education. They're trained in political science. But they focus on this because this is so big, so expensive. The budget for schools is much bigger than the entire city of Chicago. That is especially given the fact that we have separate governments for parks, for schools, for water, streets and sanitation. These are separate governments from the city of Chicago. And the city of Chicago has a budget and a city council and a mayor which makes those decisions. They do not make the decisions for those other governments. In the past, the schools were totally separate from the mayor. That changed under Mayor Daley too, so it has now been more integrated. Nevertheless, I point this out for these two people as the discipline of political science in the 60s and 70s was looking for a theory. That is, when I was shopping myself when I was a student. I was interested in politics, political analysis, and so forth, but I did not know about sociology at all. So I thought I would go to political science department. I went to meetings at the American Political Science Association, but there I listened to the papers. I listened to the creative people, and at that point they were all sociologists. Philip Converse at Michigan, Edward Shills at Chicago. Others who were working on political culture and these kinds of concepts linked with international comparisons and with Gabriel Almond, who was a student of Shills here. These people were really rebuilding political science as a theory that is, instead of being just law and political theory in the history of institutions. This was political science in the 19th and early 20th century. It changed in the mid-20th century. In the late 20th century, it came in with a new approach, economics. And so this was called public choice or social choice. And the leading people were, again from Chicago, were James Buchanan and Tulloch, Gordon Tulloch. Their book was a major statement, and they then created, and I went to one of the first meetings here in Chicago, of the Public Choice Society. And the active people there did include those involved, the two I mentioned, and they involved James Coleman, who brought me in part with his sociological linkages, but others as well. My point is this was the 60s and early 70s. The ideological debates were very active. 68, of course, the height of this at the cities with disturbances, the burning down of many cities and the like, demonstrations, highly politicized. And many of the younger scholars divided. Some of them went to the more activists' ideological direction, which has led into diversity today. This included more often people, especially younger people in sociology in some places like Berkeley in particular. Political science, on the other hand, tended to move more toward economics. And so Buchanan and Tulloch led that group. And that then variously through the next years tried to join each other back in some way. But within the section that I went regularly to the meetings of the urban politics division of the section, it was called, of the American Political Science Association, and I worked with people internationally doing the same things. There were active theoretical debates of how to join Marx with Adam Smith. And so Paul Peterson basically did a book, and he followed more the Adam Smith approach. Whereas my approach was to try to have a framework that include both a bit of Marx, both of institutional elements and components which came from Max Weber and Edward Shills and Gabriel Allman and political culture, and then third, the public choice. So in a sense, it was a multi-causal framework of these three components, and so Peterson followed a more narrow, a more he was not trained as an economist. I knew a lot more. My father was an economist in training. I had much more background than he did in terms of the economic analysis of these. But his very big concept was competition. And so the core idea from markets would be that competition would lead cities to compete with each other. So what he did that was original was instead to focus not only on the competition among individual consumers, but also of mayors and cities. And Buchanan had done this, and so Peterson synthesized some of these papers by Buchanan and some others dealing with these kinds of issues. But the ways of joining these were then being actively discussed, and I mentioned last time Clarence Stone, and Stone continued, and Stone was a political scientist in training, and he carried on the tradition from Marx. From Hunter himself said, I am a Stalinist Marxist, Floyd Hunter. Stone continued this on. Also, they both worked in the city of Atlanta, where in the South and in Atlanta, you did have, I would say empirically, a more active, visible business leadership that was very visibly inactive in ways that was not true. It was the opposite in New Haven, where Dahl had worked on the mayors and political leaders. So Peterson had seen some of this, but he was concerned also with the issue of how do policies get chosen by mayors, and so he at least was, as did I. I mean, so we then had this big these big frameworks, chapter by chapter, of how to analyze mayoral choices and then the roles of different actors and participants. His student Ken Wong, W-O-N-G, made a more subtle and nuanced argument of the same analyses as his professor Paul Peterson. But Lorna Ferguson was in the course as well, and in the book, as it was published, called City Money, which I was co-authored with a number of other students. Several were in the courses, so we had students there working together and arguing with each other, but the students also listened to us both And they saw ways of synthesizing these two approaches. And I would say synthesizing these is an important part of being creative, of not just saying you're wrong, but of trying to say, if there's a smart idea, how can we not say they're wrong, but can we find the context within which those ideas may hold? And that's what I would say I've tried to do generally, more for instance, than Peterson in that case has done. But his student, Ken Wong, did. And so Peterson's comparison by contrast, which was a useful idea, but again, it was not made up by him. It was used explicitly by Musgrave at Harvard in his book on urban economics and urban political economy. Peterson took the same three. They were similarly used by others, but I will stress as well, the big idea was from Dahl. So Dahl's idea was to look at not everything of all policies, but was to look at issue areas. And so he illustrated these with mayoral elections, urban economic development, and schools as three separate issue areas. So Peterson did the same, but he called them he gave them more general labels, which was useful. Developmental, allocational, and redistributive. Those are the three general labels. And rather than being these products of local processes, he suggested the opposite, that by the producers were a function of the issue areas themselves. That developmental decision-making is consensual and more dominated by business and civic leaders, as it actually did I turn this one on? Yeah. Okay. And so development issues tend to be active areas, arenas where banks, finance, lending, and entrepreneurs of individual projects or developers who want to, so-called developers, especially property builders of new buildings, new housing, new factories, and so forth. These tend to be, they try to bring out outside capital and keep a smiling face on all participants. The idea is, at least if you'd like to have some money to come from New York or from London or from where else, you try to say, here in Pittsburgh or here in San Francisco, we're really going to use the money very well, and this will make the value of land go up, and this will increase the return which you will have, and it will be easy for us to repay the loans at a lower interest rate. So those kinds of concerns would tend to dominate that. By contrast, the allocational decisions, not developmental, but allocational, these include police, fire, street paving. These tended to be normally conflictual within the city. So people in one neighborhood would like to have more firemen or more police or more new streets. And so where and how these are allocated tended to be more divisional, and this is the core of classic city politics, which Dahl stressed, and which is more traditionally the focus of most political science, is on conflict in that sense among local participants, whether it's in a nation or in a local government. The third are the redistributive decisions. Here, Peterson essentially argues that redistribution is giving more money from the rich people to the poor people. And if you redistribute, you take away money from the rich and you give it to the poor people, inside one city, it is then easy for the rich people to leave. They can live in the suburbs and still commute, or live further away, or simply move away, all the way from New York. Instead, they may go to Florida or Texas, where taxes are much lower. And so that dynamic led Peterson to stress competition. And so in this sense, the competition between regions and cities over redistribution and avoiding exit by the affluent led to these three kinds of dynamics in each of these kinds of issue areas. And similarly, as Musgrave had talked about, these same issue areas hold true or are used internationally as well as nationally by national economies, national governments, and so forth. Okay, this was an argument which most political scientists disliked because it focused too much on they saw politics was at least taken out of what they had seen as the core of the whole field of government politics. We went over some of the big ideas rapidly of the book City Money, and that was the book which I was working on at the time with Paul Peterson in that seminar together. So we had lots of lively discussions. He also sent around chapters, and another person thinking along these lines was Aaron Wildavsky, who was another student of Dahl, and very sharp. Dahl was probably the #1 political scientist in the U.S., probably the world, followed by Aaron Wildavsky. So Wildavsky sent a letter, a one-line postcard, I think, to Paul Peterson, which was, "What about New York? What's wrong?" So Paul was very worried about this. He wrote a new chapter to try to answer that question. Because, why was that so important, theoretically? Because New York has classically done a lot of redistribution. It's very expensive. It also went bankrupt twice, and roughly at the time that we were working on these two books was the time of the so-called the New York fiscal crisis. It was leading into the New York fiscal crisis, with in the 60s and 70s. So I spent 2 summers in Washington simultaneously in this period, and then worked actively. I got recruited because of seeing these kinds of issues being debated in Washington. The main activists were the U.S. Conference of Mayors. And so the mayors wanted to have more money from the national government. And so they would lobby together, all the mayors, and try to pressure the White House and the U.S. Congress. And they then invited, initially we had over 100 different policy analysts, political scientists, sociologists, economists, public policy people. And we had many conferences around the country, especially with the mayors. Then from those, there were 4, and I continued as one of the 4 people continued to actively work with the U.S. Conference of Mayors, and spent a summer at the Brookings Institution and the Urban Institute, both of which were leading institutions studying cities linked with the national government. And so especially the question of redistribution. And so Peterson's argument was local governments cannot redistribute because you'll drive away the rich. And so Wildavsky's question was, how about New York? There's still some rich people in New York. But I guess in part, one answer is a lot of the rich people have left. and they left around 1890. As this happened in many of the northeastern cities where they had more responsibilities for covering expensive things like public education. And so in the cities of, say, just to mention two, New Haven, where Yale was with Dahl, and New York, in the 1830s, for instance, when Tocqueville came here, this was heavily a white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant set of immigrants from England, essentially, largely. By the end of the 19th century, they became a minority of the citizens, a minority of the voters. The new voters were Irish, Polish, Italian, German, and they were more than the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. And so the old Protestants so in part, let's say in the case of, just to illustrate briefly, in New Haven, basically, most of the old elite moved out. They moved to the suburbs, and most of them stopped doing politics. They returned to civic affairs, to their private businesses, to doing other things, arts, and the like. In New York, they did both. That is, some of them withdrew. That is, there were lots of new suburban developments all across, and this was happening as well outside London, outside Paris, outside Geneva, and so forth. But at the same time, in New York, and this was the topic of Gabriel Almond, who had this political cultural background, but earlier for his PhD, he followed a more Marxist approach, neo-Marxist perspective, which I managed to publish later on, as it had been ignored at the time. But the white Anglo-Saxons and some of the Jewish activists created various taxpayers associations or good government organizations, and they were critical of the political leadership that was increasingly dominated by a political machine, and it was increasingly led by first Irish and then by Italian Roman Catholics. And the Roman Catholic Church joined these often to a considerable degree in ways that led to more spending and more taxes. This in turn led in 1933 and in the 70s basically, John Lindsay and then others led essentially to the bankruptcy of New York, and they in turn said, can the state government of New York please give us and lend us the money to continue? And they said in turn, we'll go to Washington. Can the president and the Congress please give us enough money? I think it was $3.2 billion, 2.3, 3.2, 2.3. Oh, that is, these days it wasn't very large, but it was seen as huge. And so the federal government, and I spent a summer in Washington when these battles were going on. Would they give that money to New York or not, and why? So the paper I did was to analyze how many other cities are there that may have fiscal problems, because the New Yorkers said, these are because we are a city, we need more money because cities they said implicitly, all cities have problems like this. So what we did was we went around and said, has anybody else measured the fiscal problems of cities? And we found no. There were nobody in the U.S. Treasury, in the White House, in the budget departments and the like, the Treasury, the Board of Governors, the Federal Reserve had no data on fiscal problems of city governments in the United States. So we did the first. And so we compared, we had 60 or so cities, and we created couple of dozen of fiscal strain indicators. And this in turn gave us a lot of money, a lot of interest, a lot of consulting activity, and working with the Conference of Mayors. And because we showed there were big differences from city to city. There was not one pattern of cities illustrated by New York. No, New York was very extreme, and showing that was very controversial. So this, when the summary of this was in the New York Times, that in turn led to to many of these issues being explored as I'm here briefly discussing some of this. Let me, I'll pause for a minute if you have any questions on what I've said thus far. Anything you want to raise? Okay, let me push on. Let me talk then about the next step, in a sense, as an alternative. If we have Adam Smith tradition directly from Peterson, Saskia Sassen extends the Peterson argument globally, but she makes several points in the introduction. That the global markets are dispersed and competitive, and the key corporations retain command centers at their peaks, which are located at headquarters of a handful of global cities. These few cities are distinctive due to their high density of producer services, like accounting and law firms, management consulting, advertising, finance. These depend on personal face-to-face contacts with top executives of top global corporations. Hence, they take off especially in London, New York, and Tokyo. And so she focuses on these three cities in her book. And as manufacturing declines, older industrial cities, smaller, lose their power, wealth, and residence, move instead toward these global world cities. Similarly, middle managers lose income and decline in numbers, as do the highly skilled and highly paid production workers, as these are replaced by higher tech machines and the lower cost workers globally. Mexico and China were particularly attacked by local officials across the US and in Europe. These could reduce the jobs of production, which computers, global communication, air transit, and low-cost labor in other parts of the world would make possible more competitive markets globally. This is a controversial extension of the decline of manufacturing. See, she suggests that income inequalities rise in world cities with the impact of global markets, because the affluent grow more affluent if they were working in these global businesses like bankers and lawyers, and that they would spend more money for maid service, chauffeurs, and the like at the bottom end of the income scale, thereby generating more inequality of income. So we can summarize the main arguments that come largely from her work in a global set. The points are here. The top line on the right, globalization leads to more inequality. This is the strong argument. She does not mention Adam Smith. She did not mention Karl Marx. It talks as if she's just making it up, or that it's straightforward, but instead she has these two conflicting perspectives. The strong cleavage version, of course, extending Karl Marx, but she's not a theorist. And she and I taught several courses here as well, which Paul Peterson went to Harvard. She came here, and we we had a number of students working in cities and cities globally. I continually disagreed with Saskia and would say, there's no politics in your book. And she said, oh, but we deal with the issues. Well, she wrote later books where there's a lot of politics in her later books, but she revised when she was here the book which we have the main, it's her more serious book, most serious book, and that one she spent the most time on, and what we have here is what we discussed of how it could be done differently. And so again, I'm making a simple point that students in these classes learn in the process. If faculty disagree, this is creative. You can see new ideas potentially emerging, as with Ken Wong, and so there was a Chinese student named Xing Zong, and she did a master's thesis, and she worked with Jim Heckman and others in economics, and so what she did, and so I helped advise her on this, and we then published a paper by herself, by me, and Saskia Sassen. Even though Saskia really disagreed with a lot of it, at least we did it together, and she had from the economics background a statistical data model that was not in Saskia Sassen's work. And we did the same in City Money. We have both cases, and we have comparative quantitative analysis. So she had measures of fiscal strain, of spending, of budgets, and of inequality. Not just 3 cities or 1 city in the U.S., but all of the metro areas, the biggest cities, the areas with the biggest cities in the U.S. And then she analyzed inequality and where and why they had more or less inequality. And then the question would be, how do you measure globalization? So we have a couple of different measures, and if you use immigration, the percentage of immigrants who are living in a city, like 1 city, does that lead to more inequality because they take lower salary jobs? And the answer was yes. To some degree, we found support for that. The second one was, I think it was foreign born, and I forgot what the second one was, but the third one, which was particularly stressed by Saskia Sassen, was the producer services, accounting, finance, law. Do those cities with more producer services have more growth and more affluent people? And the answer is yes. But does it also lead to more inequality? The answer was no. Her theory was wrong. So here we have the dynamics different between the more affluent and the least affluent. And so that instead of saying inequality is the product, if you look separately, what are the dynamics for migration into a city or out from a city, the kinds of things of suburbanization and so forth also being there, you get very different results. And the bottom line is, if you do what Sassen did not do, multi-causal analysis, like a regression in statistics, she didn't have that. If she did that, as Xing Zhong did, then she showed 0 impact of producer services. And so this in turn led to a student, Jeroen van der Wal, in the Netherlands, did another PhD. He found he was even much more critical of Sassen than we were, but basically continued the same kind of points. And some of these points I'm going to put here very briefly. The second line is, globalization may lead to inequality, but that may lead afterward to anti-inequality policies. And so you could say this might have happened in London in part, that the English, if they could see that there could be more poor people losing, that is, people who had high-paying jobs may lose their jobs, maybe become unemployed, the English had more generous support for these people than in the US. And so that anti-inequality policy, in a sense, could be rich, or let's say generous unemployment benefits. The third kind of theoretical or dynamic is that the globalization could lead here to knowledge about the percentage of these different kinds of policies, and some could be simple, so two paths, A and B, that we could have knowledges that this might lead to spreading down of services as well as products, which could go to the rich and to the poor, and that the globalization could lead to, such as you could say, cheap goods coming from China could reduce the cost of buying those goods for poor as well as affluent Americans or Europeans. Okay, so this argument is that this would not necessarily lead to inequality, but these anti-inequality policies could be recognized and then articulated in this dynamic by political theories. And so you have this now in part with Trump and Harris. They're fighting in part over these international policies because of these kinds of dynamics, which at least they're trying to articulate these. The fourth path is there are other variables. That these things may be happening, but they may explain a small amount of variation. And it may be many other things are much more important that explain income or inequality, which are altogether different variables. And these have been studied more, say, by lots of people. Economics has done this for the 20th century. Okay, so in that sense, there's a more visible role for economics, for politics, and for joining these together, and not simply talking about globalization or narrowly defined processes of the sort which both Peterson and Sassen had largely presented. So one example, for instance, was Nobel laureate in economics Bob Lucas pushed this dynamic in where he did a paper to suggest that not one city like New York, but the entire globe is increasing globalization. That is, we're having, with the end of especially the end of the Cold War in 1989, with the Berlin Wall going down, the Cold War ended in simple terms. Globalization generally increased, and he basically suggested that as we move away from these closed blocks and we had more widespread trade, not only the end of the Berlin Wall, there was a famous opera and more called Nixon in China. Okay, Nixon went to China, and he also went with a guy with him named Henry Kissinger. And Kissinger's idea was, let's work with the Chinese and not leave them alone and say you can only talk to the Russians. Let's talk to each other. And they did. Okay, and so Lucas basically suggests this will lead everyone to be more affluent. That we are increasingly part of, we can say maybe not necessarily one nation, but one world, and part of many of the self-interests, of the concerns by the Chinese and the U.S. are shared. And because we have issues of poor people in China, poor people in the U.S., and we have rich in both. The question is, where and how can we use these sorts of differences to try to build on, and in turn build complementarities, not competition. India is another classic example where the Indians who spoke better than the Chinese spoke English, and they immediately got jobs in California in Silicon Valley. And many, they were engineers, you know, as poor people in education, but with high education. They were very smart. They built computers. They went back to India and then included a number of new corporations with low-income persons in some Indian cities geared toward high-tech and international trade. And so you have thousands and millions of people working, especially in English-speaking countries. India, another classic example is the Philippines. And if you call up and you're an American, or you're an English-speaking person in Australia or England, you call up and you say, you know, my MS Word is not working. Please tell me what's wrong. And you're likely to hear an Indian or a Filipino voice, as we have global differentiation of these kinds of services. And so Lucas's theoretical point was the globe is a finite entity, and that over time, the economic classic long run, globalization should equalize incomes of everyone in every country, since markets will continually seek the best value. That is, global inequality should be the opposite of Sassen's argument if we look at these factors internationally. Hence, the Sassen results for New York may reflect, one, a specific point in time when industry was falling and finance was rising. Two, the salaries are so low in locations like Mexico that Mexicans are still attracted to New York for low wages. Third, as Mexican wages rise, Mexican migrations will slow and wages will rise for all in New York and the world. And NAFTA has moved in this direction. Fourth, this market process may be countered if global corporations are able to retain command posts like monopolies that give them monopolistic profits. This is a strong hypothesis that has been empirically tested, and they found weak relative. I won't try to go into that, but that takes us to the key points from these two statements from Peterson and Sassen. I'll mention just briefly that the themes here are elaborated, especially in the course in the winter I teach, called global local politics. And the global argument is presented. I've just left it with Sassen, but we have others such as the best-selling book is called "The World is Flat" by Thomas Friedman, who was an analyst, and he took this title from an Indian computer leader who said the world is flat. So we want to trade with everybody in the world, and we want to be part of that. And people don't have to leave India. They can work here in India, in our city, and because we have now such high-tech cable lines, etc., we can communicate nearly instantly, and this makes it possible to increase the wages over time of the people in India, and that has clearly happened. So the wages in many of these computer-related services by the people in India are now close to those in the West. So that's an illustration, you could say, of the Lucas process operating. These let me stop for a bit. Do we have any question, comment you want to raise with any of this? Okay. the let me then push on with a little bit of the next stage. I will continue on Wednesday, which is to say, where and how can we join market and non-market processes and services and goods? And the background of this, which is one of these, I'll just mention in terms of the history of theory. This is a bit in the Scenescapes book. Well, if you flash forward in the chapter on the economy, which is, what are the social classes that divide and lead the economic classes to differentiate? Adam Smith had three classes: the workers, the owners, and the farmers. The farmers were dropped and so Malthus was in between. Malthus really made a lot about land value and how land would increase, and that in turn would lead to immigration to bigger cities and so forth. But that was left out by Marx. Marx was a student of Hegel. Hegel basically had two classes. The idea was that the history of theory, the history of philosophy was driven by conflict, and conflict was strongest when there were two, a rich and a poor, or a white and a black, manufacturing and owners, or capital and workers. These kinds of things which Marx in turn, nobody knew this until about the 1930s. Marx, as a young man, was a student of Hegel, and he wrote basically a book, or a series of essays, and they were not published in his lifetime, but they were published by the Moscow Publishing House in the 1930s, and it made a big impact. Why? He added two interesting big concepts. One was alienation. The idea was that you as a student or as a religious person, you could grow alienated from your past beliefs. Or you could be, in terms of the bourgeois, the term widely used in say Marxist circles later on, but by lots of others through the 19th century, the term bourgeois was, especially in the continental discussion, was classic. Marx wrote, the bourgeois leadership can be alienated from their self-interest of the bourgeoisie, and they can become partially a new, and in the case of Lenin, a vanguard party. And the vanguard party can break away from the traditional bourgeoisie, and then that can become used by even the arts and culture. And the most visible example was Bertolt Brecht in his 1920s and 30s in The Threepenny Opera and Mahagoni, stressed the ways in which through entertainment you can alienate and engage people to break away from even their entertainment and their self-interest in what is capitalistic bourgeois society. And he then I won't go into too much detail there. For the moment, we'll talk a little more later. But he went to Hollywood when Hitler came along, and with Faulkner, with Adorno, Horkheimer, Brecht, they were all in Hollywood, and they developed what was called the black film, le noir, le film noir. And these basically were a minority They had a small, but they still made dozens of films. But the majority of the world viewers did not pay attention to them until we had more. Another transformation was education. The 1960s, there was an explosion of higher education in Western Europe, Asia, and you had more and more people getting university training. They then became more alienated from their traditional, in the case of China, Chinese communist backgrounds, to become a little more independent. And so the term which is now being used of many of these university graduates who do not have jobs, in good part because they choose not to have jobs, and they say we are lying back. We are not working like my father, working as a manual laborer in a machine factory. I say, I'd do something else if I can find it, but I don't find it, so I'll live at home. And there's a huge unemployment rate in China today, and the leadership is very concerned about what to do. And so I've been doing video lectures and conferences with Chinese people, and many of them are economists. Economists are saying, we no longer have a required one child only. We can have more children, but the women are not having children. And the workers are not, the university graduates are not going to work. What are we going to do? So these are questions that economists in China are asking in a serious way, and these are linked with these themes which we're dealing with in this course. And so the question is, how can we look at what concepts and frameworks can we put together that will work in a context which is either a traditional communist background, and it's still called the Communist Party, which governs officially in China, and do the same processes? Which of these processes are which change in the West? And how can Adam Smith be joined with Marx? One simple answer is that if we have T equals I plus psychic, that the total income is equal to the monetary income plus the psychic income. The psychic income is largely non-market income, which from a city standpoint includes low crime, good schools, an attractive view like lakefronts and flowers, museums, parks, bicycle paths, and more. Taken together, these add up. And so the label of these is also amenities. Amenities are a term for non-market goods and services from economics, and we use them in the book on scenescapes to elaborate in a new way, which we'll talk about when we get there. But I will add here that we regularly ask a question. Where do you want to live? How many of you would choose to live, if you're at the University of Chicago, do you want to stay in a city like Chicago or New York or London and be paid $100,000 a year? Or would you go to a small town with very few of these amenities, but you have the countryside in a town of maybe 2,000 in a little town, say in North Dakota, in the U.S. But you're paid $200,000, twice as large a salary. How many of you, and this is a question I've asked for many years of the students, how many of you would take the job for $200,000, or how many would take $100,000, half the salary? What have we found over the years? A great majority In the past, it used to be almost everyone would say, I'll take the half this, I'll take the 100,000. I'll stay in Chicago. What does that mean? The total income is larger in Chicago, not because of the money, but because of the amenities which they're getting. And those amenities are worth more than $100,000 per student, per person. And if you're a mayor, the answer is you should invest in those amenities because you'll keep talent here, and the talent in turn will be human capital, which in turn will be more creative, and they use the physical capital, the technology which we have in Chicago. And so we had the emergence of the futures markets, finance, etc. And now we have bits of those. We have some manufacturing as well. They're manufacturing Fords and more here. But we've had an explosion then after that of entertainment, Brecht. And so the films which they started as film noir and were not paid attention to, now there are lots of people, not only in Chicago, but you have artist neighborhoods in medium-sized cities across the U.S., across Western Europe, and in sometimes some medium large cities in China and Korea, where they have an art city, a whole art of people, a whole city of doing art, etc. These are transformation, or we can call monetarization of these amenities in ways that the aesthetics become drivers of the economy in ways that I did a book with others called The City as an Entertainment Machine. So the entertainment machine is part of the new economy, that these kinds of bicycle paths, museums, aesthetics are new drivers of the economy. And so this is one of the 5 general theories that we're talking about in this first half of the course. This is a way where you can directly incorporate the use of consumption, amenities, aesthetics, and the arts fits with a Adam Smith, Chicago contemporary tradition of analyzing markets and how they can include the amenities along with the more traditional variables of class, production, jobs, which we're including the production of issues, the production of goods and services in contrast to also the consumption. So these are ways that we can join the two in ways that we will sketch out in more detail as we continue, and add other variables that can link with those bits of framework as I've laid them out. So I'll stop there unless any follow-up questions that you want to pose at this point.
Actually, I'm very interested about.
Can you speak just a little louder so we can record it?
Actually, I'm very interested about you mentioned the issue before, like the Chinese, the China.
Yeah, it's fine. Just stand closer so you can hear it.
Yeah, because a lot of young people currently in China cannot find a job
A lot of people are what?
Cannot find a job.
Cannot find jobs.
Yeah,
Yes.
after he graduates from the university, they just choose like to prepare some task for government to get a job from the government or just stay at home. So I'm just wondering is that how can we think about this and do some analysis for this?
I have directly asked exactly your question recently in your city of Wuhan. I was in a workshop in an economics department where they had also invited researchers, and they have a group of them who are in public policy, from economics, political science. They were in a workshop together, and they said, how can we explain the decline in the birth rate, and the unemployment, which is high, and that the economy is not growing as fast as it might. And I said, don't we have a lot of people who are graduates who are not working, and women who are not having children? Why are they making those decisions? And so, do you have any research, or could you do any research if you don't have something to answer these big policy questions? And so they said, yes, we should. So they said yes, but then one person said, well, the things which we now are discussing are that the national government is not doing enough to help the disadvantaged, that the poor are not getting enough money for them. And the second one was, that is, they gave two answers that were macro national policy answers. And I said, maybe, but how about also looking locally, because you have differences by city, by neighborhood, and by individual. And why are those choices are being made? And why don't you look, for example, at the membership in the local organizations or the local individual activities? If you look at time budgets or data where we have, what are the popular activities being chosen by young men who do not have jobs, and young women who may have jobs but who are not married and not raising families, and therefore the birth rate is going down. That is, so I said, why don't we look in the minds of these young people to understand their thinking and their cultural concerns, which are played out in these new consumption patterns. And let's look at new consumption patterns of using bicycles or the environment or women's issues. I mean, what are women's issues in China? And last year I supervised five Chinese women. All of them wrote about Chinese women, and there were 5 totally different MA theses on women in China, ranging from a strong feminist to we must have more tradition to help the tradition become stronger, and everything in between. So that is, there are very big differences within the heads of young people in China, and I would add within young people in France, young people in Germany, young people in the Ukraine, and in the U.S. That there is a different, we can say fragmentation, we can say a differentiation. There is a subtilization of, instead of saying I want more, they don't just want more money. I'm giving you the example of the USC students who say, no, I'll stay in the city with more amenities, to the degree that they'll pay $100,000 to give that up. So young people want, and Wuhan, that is your city. I had another student who brought me a photograph of when the COVID regulations were loosened in Wuhan. Immediately there was a photograph of the downtown cities, the downtown streets were filled with thousands of people walking and looking around. You know, we're breathing the air, and they, in a sense that, you know, we want to be here downtown, and we want to be able to see one another as people, and so the women were dressing very well. That is differently. That is, it was a striking photograph. But it also had 1 or 2 people who were, that is, the student gave it to me, and she was very cautious. She didn't want to say anything politically, but she gave me the photo. And the photo said a lot that I would say, which I can summarize as diversity, or let's say, many different faces with many different expression. And if we, as social scientists, we want to capture this, measure it systematically, we can do so, and we have the tools to do so. But we need this not only in China. We also need it in Chicago. We need it in London. We need it in Moscow. The people are very different. Even if it, and especially as I would add, the U.S. and the Western media covers none of this stuff. That as I talk to the Chinese, these are big issues. And I gave you the example of the seminar by smart economists and politics, and that is, I'll add, if the Chinese do not change their current patterns of birth rate, development, and so forth, the Chinese population will drop by half in something like 25 years. And so the Chinese population drops by half. That's a pretty big thing to think about. Okay, so what are the alternatives, and what and why are things which are worth talking about, and social scientists can do this and participate in an active way. Not as if we have, and I would say, there's not one answer. I'm sure there are many different answers as we have, but I'm also pointing out cross-nationally, very similar processes are going on around the world. And if we get comparable data, then we can say how similar or how different are they in China or in city one in Guangdong versus Wuhan versus Beijing versus Shanghai and so forth, and by neighborhood.
Yeah, and also there have some similar phenomena happen in like Korea or Japan.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
No, absolutely. Tokyo and Seoul have that is the big difference between China and Korea is that China is very strict in keeping out mostly foreigners. There's very little immigration from outside China into, whereas Korea is the opposite. That is the young farmers in Korea try to find a wife. They can't find wives. The Korean women have gone to Seoul, or they've gone to New York and London, but they're not in the small towns. And so the government is trying to give money to encourage things like the arts or other things in the local areas. But short term, the young farmers are marrying Vietnamese, Indonesians, and Chinese women. And now they have big programs for the government to train these foreigners to teach the Korean language and about Korean history and how to raise your children so they know what it means to be a Korean. So they don't have those problems, but in Korea these are big issues. And so Japan and China do not let immigrants in very much. Korea does, and so those are three big important countries. Big. Only China's really big, but they have the same issues, but their answers are very different already. So we're trying to work with people in these three countries, and they each have very different policy concerns, but we can see where and why many of the same background drivers were very similar in all of the three. And I mean that there are many factors, but if we just consider cell phones and education, we lead to many more differentiation. So we have social media. That people can do all different kinds of lifestyles. They combine them in new ways, and we have we have one more variable: the explosion of cafes. Cafes is little ways of people sitting and talking with each other. In part, especially because of if you live in Shanghai or Seoul or Tokyo, it's very expensive. And these young women have little small apartments, and so they go out and they work and they have fun, or they do the combination in cafes. So these are taking off, and so where and how, and so there are far more cafes expanding in Seoul than in than in London, New York, Paris, all put together. Seoul is, that is, there were no cafes in any of these cities to speak of. They had coffee houses, they had tea houses traditionally for hundreds of years in Asia. But the cafes came from France and from Italy. Indirectly, by a little bit by Starbucks. So Starbucks, the Chinese and the Japanese think of Starbucks bringing the cafe, but it was a Latin, there were no cafes in Chicago until 25 years ago. That is, Americans would say this is not a cafe society. That's a Southern European tradition, not an American Protestant hardworking. And it was fought as an institution that a cafe was a sign of decadent consumption, not very long ago. And so then, and the same thing is seen with ironic or wondering distance in Asia, with its small, and with the Communist Party stressing growth and production and constraining consumption. And now it can, if you somehow let it become more open, then what to do for the economy, for planning, for government policies is very complicated. And there are no easy answers. They're not fast, but I would say there are many things which could and can be done or are being done. And our Scenes Academy, with the 300 papers in China, Chinese journals published on these scenes kinds of issues, and these are where that often local and neighborhood policies, such as bicycle paths or other things, can be done to make people more positively integrated and enjoy not only living in Wuhan or Beijing, but who will also stay in small town rural villages and see this as attractive. And this is a new pattern, which is that is it's an older European pattern, having a second home in the countryside. But the Chinese are starting to think with this too.
They're starting talking about these things like encourage people to go back to the countryside or other place to develop their hometown city. It's quite interesting.
Okay. Well, thank you for the question, and we have. Let me turn this off.
So for the discussion,